Before we get going, we need a definition and a definition for environmental management systems. Again, we go to our trusted standard, ISO 14001, which defines an EMS as an informal or formal structured framework for managing environmental responsibilities. Let's just take a step back again to talk about standards and guidances. And ISO 14001 2015 is an environmental management system which defines requirements with guidance and use. There is also, as previously mentioned, the EMAS, the Eco Management Audit Scheme, which is a voluntary instrument developed by the European Commission. And we have also ISO 14005 2019, which gives you the guidelines for EMS for a flexible approach for phased implementation. This slide is really just to give you a quick overview in terms of the standards and some of the guidances that there are available. Let's now talk about reasons, and here we're focusing on how we can demonstrate management commitment and assure our stakeholders. In ISO 14001 clause 5.1, which is all about leadership and commitment, it states that commitment is shown by aligning the EMS with the organization's business objectives. And it also ensures the necessary resources are available, and it encourages also employees and other relevant interested parties to become actively involved in improving environmental performance. And also here we talk about involving everyone in decisions that affects them. Not to forget that we want to promote open discussions about environmental matters. So some key themes here about how to demonstrate management commitment and assure stakeholders. When it comes to talking about demonstrating commitment towards pollution prevention and control or protection of the environment, in ISO 14001 there are minimum requirements for an environmental policy, and these include a commitment to the protection of the environment and a commitment to the prevention of pollution. It also provides a framework for setting objectives and targets, and this could be by helping us to define measurable and achievable specific targets, and it also helps us in terms of creating objectives that are compatible at tactical, strategic and operational levels. This could be in terms of resource usage, energy and water use, waste generation, carbon emissions or biodiversity. 14001 will also help us to complement our corporate social responsibility, our CSR, and sustainable or sustainability policies and strategies. Now, previously mentioned, CSR refers to the obligations of businesses to pursue those policies which are desirable in terms of objectives and values of our society. So in effect, CSR is a commitment to behave ethically and contribute to economic development whilst improving the quality of life of the workforce, their families, communities and the environment. So CSR is a commitment by the organization to environmental awareness, and also an EMS can help us achieve those sort of commitments. It also provides an integrated approach for health, safety and environment. When you look at the various standards and frameworks, we can also bring in the quality aspects. So it really helps us to avoid duplication, minimize conflict, and also help in terms of speeding up decisions within the organization, the decision-making process. And we can also have the opportunity to combine the audits for HS, E, and Q, which also helps us in terms of inspections, reviews, and resource management, nicely complementing the Plan, Do, Check, Act loop that can be seen in this graphic here. But there are going to be pressures from interested parties, and the reasons for implementing an environmental management system is it helps us to address some of the pressures that are going to come from these external stakeholders. And these could include things like the public, financial institutions, insurance agencies, environmental pressure groups. We talked about this in element 1, Extinction Rebellion, and a few other sort of external parties here. Shareholders, employees and contractors, although employees here could be considered as internal stakeholders here, and also regulators. So customers, organizations, suppliers, this is where the pressure can come into the organization from external parties. I will say up front, this is going to get heavy because we're going to be diving into the various clauses of the standard, going from 4 5, all the way through to 10. Within each of these clauses under the Plan, Do, Check, Act, there are various sub-clauses. I know it's confusing. There are sub-elements that we're talking about here within the NEBOSH online study course, but here we're talking about sub-clauses within the main clause of the standard. Let's start first with Clause 4. Clause 4 is all about the context of the organization. And here, the environmental issues that affect an organization will vary greatly depending on their size, complexity, and the type of industry that they're in. In this section, what's required is we need to establish internal and external issues that could affect the business or interested parties, and any compliance regulations that you'll need to meet from an organizational perspective. What do we mean by an interested party? As defined before, is a person or organization that can be affected by, or perceive themselves to be affected by a decision or activity. This is just a memo jogger from previous slides that we've talked about where it involved interested parties. Now, in Clause 4, there are 4 sub-clauses. 4.1 to 4.4, we talk about organization, its context, the needs and expectations, what is the scope of an EMS, and also the environmental management system. Firstly, interested parties and EMS scope and boundaries. And here, the interested parties, we need to determine the needs and expectations of interested parties. When it comes to looking at EMS scope and boundaries, here we need to define the boundaries or the ring fence and the applicability of the EMS. But let's not forget that the scope must include the activities, the products, services that could have the potential to impact an organization's environmental performance. Key things there is that we must include those specific activities. What do we mean by understanding the requirements? Well, here we need to carry out a high-level overview of the business and identify issues that can positively or negatively impact how the organization manages its environmental responsibilities. These could be internal challenges or external challenges. Internal are things such as activities, the culture within the organization, and also capabilities. Externally, the challenges here are political, legal, technological, and economic. The key thing is to identify and assess risks and opportunities that these issues could pose to the organization or to the environmental management system. So understanding requirements is very specific when it comes to context of the organization. Clause 5 now, and Clause 5, like most ISO standards, here you're required to outline the staff roles and responsibilities within the EMS. Now, the standard also outlines the importance of top managers and involvement by them in the implementation, maintenance, and continual improvement of the EMS. Clause 5 has 3 subclauses. 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, and 5.1 is all about leadership and commitment, going through to the policy and looking at organizational roles, responsibilities, and authorities. In leadership and commitment, what we need to do is we must clearly demonstrate leadership and commitment to the EMS. And these could be examples such as communicating environmental goals or involvement in objective setting, performance evaluation, and follow-up. There could also be broad and active involvement in management reviews and other management forums where EMS is on the agenda. But we can also show leadership and commitment by inspiring initiatives, motivating staff, and alignment with strategy. So some key things here when it comes to leadership and commitment in Clause 5 or Subclause 5.1. We talk about environmental policy. Here, top management should establish, implement, and maintain an environmental policy. And that policy should be appropriate for the purpose and context of the organization, relative to what they do, what business they're in, etc. And it should be really providing a framework for setting and reviewing objectives and targets. There must be a clear commitment, and it should state a commitment to the protection of the environment, to fulfill obligations, compliance obligations or legal obligations, and also clearly show continual improvement in there as a part of the organization's way forward into the future. And most importantly, this policy should be communicated to all relevant and interested parties. Here we're talking about stakeholders, external and internal to the organization. And about roles and responsibilities in Clause 5, which is all about leadership and commitment, we need to here make sure that management are clear in terms of roles and responsibilities that are assigned within the organization when it comes to the EMS. The roles and responsibilities should be communicated at all levels within the organization, and it should be maintained as a documented information or documented procedure and include typically things such as operational procedures, what are the tasks and description of the tasks, what are the jobs that people do, and also any training packages that are associated with them. Roles and responsibilities have to be clear in an organization if we're expecting people to do certain tasks or certain things when it comes to looking at environmental management. But when it comes to roles and responsibilities, we need to make sure we have the right staff, the right people, etc. And that's when we look at resources. So here, management should ensure the availability of resources, and this includes that they have the relevant skills, the knowledge within the workforce, they have the infrastructure, the buildings and the equipment that they need to do their jobs effectively, especially when it comes to environmental management. Make sure they have the budget and the finances, and also make sure we provide them adequate time for carrying out these tasks and duties assigned. In most companies, when it comes to environmental management, these are add-on features that people have to their roles, and therefore it's important that we give them sufficient time and space to make sure that those tasks are taken care of. On to Clause 6 now, and here we're looking at planning, and this clause of the standard relates to identifying any risks or opportunities that could impact the organization's EMS, and also then planning to address them where it's necessary. More specifically, we need to set our objectives and also state how we plan to achieve them within the EMS framework. Clause 6 is quite heavy in terms of sub-clauses, and there are also sub-clauses. Here we have 6.1, 6.2 split into the various sub-clauses and sub-clauses that you can see. I'm not going to go into detail on the slides for this. We're going to cover it in the next few sections that are coming up. So let's first start with some definitions. We need a good definition here for aspects and impacts, and we can refer to the ISO standard for giving us some guidance. In the standard, an aspect is defined as an element of an organization's activities or products that interacts or can interact with the environment. An impact is where there's a change to the environment, whether adverse or beneficial, wholly or partially resulting from the organization's aspects. See how those two are very connected together, and here we're not just talking about negative impacts but also positive impacts. It's important to understand that there are positive gains also that we can get from specific aspects. Planning also looks at things such as identifying environmental aspects and associated impacts. And here we need to take into consideration risk, and specifically aspects that can have a significant environmental impact. And we need to include change, anything that's related to planned or new development as a part of the change management process. We need to look at things such as new or modified activities, products and services, which is also incorporated within change management processes. Let's not forget abnormal conditions and also any reasonable, foreseeable emergency situations. We need to make sure that we're communicating these amongst the various levels of the organization so that everybody's aware of their role, their responsibilities, and what they need to do when it comes to planning and also in terms of aspects and impacts management. But most importantly, of course, we need to maintain documentation that's appropriate for this particular planning. We need to make sure that we have the aspects and impacts register in place and that the organization is aware of it and is communicating that within the organization. An environmental objective is defined in the standard as an objective set by the organization that aligns and is consistent with its environmental policy. Looking at environmental objectives, we need to ensure that the objectives are consistent with the policy, they're measurable, they're monitored, they're communicated, updated, and also make sure that we have the tools to achieve those objectives. We want to get continual improvement here through quantifiable indicators and metrics. I suspect many of you are familiar with this graphic that's come up, which is called SMART. This is how we can look at how actions management in any framework. The S stands for specific, M for measurable, A for achievable, R for relevant, and T for time-bound. If we can tick the box on all of the SMART acronym letters for actions related to objectives or targets, then we're onto a winning streak. When it comes to planning, we also need to look at life cycle analysis. What is a life cycle analysis? The definition for that is it's the act of measuring the environmental impact of a product or service throughout its life cycle, from the resources used to create the product or service across its use by the user and to its final end-of-life destination. There is a small graphic here which we're going to elaborate on further in the slide deck, but you can see we start with raw materials, looking at transportation, production, distribution, and end of life. So it really echoes the sentence up here in terms of the definition for an LCA. Now, the LCA or the life cycle stages that are applicable will vary depending on the activity, product, or service in the organization. Not every organization will probably have something to do with transportation, but in any event, it's important to consider all those different stages and see the applicability for the organization. Planning also, we need to take into account risks and opportunities and risk management processes. The organization should make every attempt to determine the risks that can affect its environmental performance, look at ways of how to manage those risks, and also identify opportunities to improve performance. They can select their own method for addressing risk based on the context in which it operates, such as a qualitative process or a full quantitative assessment. And it can be related, for example, environmental aspects, compliance obligations, or needs and expectations of interested parties. Planning in terms of compliance obligations, here we need to take into account existing breaches, violations, etc. of national and local law, any requirements in terms of permits or licenses, agreements with non-governmental organizations, and also any public authorities or any voluntary codes of practice that we have compliance obligations for. And our approach should be evidence-based, and it should be an auditable sort of process that's provided, and it should have a sound and viable operational plan. It should also be linked to the policy, to the various clauses within ISO 14001, and also that should help in the analysis process when it's needed. Getting heavier but lighter at the same time, we're now into clause 7, so we've done 4, 5 and 6. In clause 7, this is the largest section of the standard, and it addresses requirements on resources, communication and documentation. You'll need to ensure that your employees at all levels in the organization are informed of the policies of the management system, and they understand what their roles and responsibilities are to help contributing towards the environmental management process. Here we can see a breakdown of the clauses and the sub-clauses and the sub-sub-clauses. If you thought clause 6 was hard enough in terms of sub-sub-clauses, we have a lot more here. Let's go into now resources, clause 7, when it looks at support. Here we need to determine and provide resources that are needed for establishment, implementation and continual improvement of the EMS. We need to make sure that the provided resources are in a timely manner, and the allocation should consider not only current requirements but future requirements as well. And these resources could include human, such as skilled workers, natural, could be a resource like oil or water, infrastructure, do they need special equipment, special machinery, any technology needed, maybe cameras, or financial. We always need financial. Here we're looking at sort of budgetary requirements. In support, we also need to look at competence, but we need a definition. And ISO provides us, ISO 14001 provides us with a definition. Competence is the ability to apply knowledge and skills to achieve the intended result. So organizations should assess competence, determine training needs, and also taking the actions that they need to acquire the necessary competence. And this could be internally sourced or externally sourced here. When it comes to awareness, the organization should ensure that the relevant persons are aware of their environmental policy and that they're also aware of the environmental aspects and impacts associated with their work. You don't know what you don't know. So we need to make sure that the people who can impact the environment with things that they're doing, the tasks and activities, they're aware of it so that they can help towards contribution in terms of environmental management. Communication is another piece and support, and this is internal and external to the organization. We need to demonstrate, or the organization needs to demonstrate, the communication of the policy, the roles, the responsibilities, the objectives, and also the aspects and impacts. In support, we have documented information, and the standard defines this as the information required to be controlled and maintained by an organization, as well as the medium on which it is contained, the digital format. Here, the organization needs to determine the level of documented information necessary to control its EMS. Let's not forget that resources aren't infinite in an organization, so it should be commensurate with the type of resources that you've got and the amount of resources that you've got. Otherwise, you'll create a data mountain that becomes pretty much difficult to manage. In clause 8, where we talk about operation, in this clause, it states that the organization needs to assess which activities have a significant environmental impact, and also we should establish processes for the activities that are contained within the scope of the management system. And this could include manufacturing, transportation, product disposal. All of these processes should incorporate solutions to the risks identified in clause 6. We take a step back, you remember the life cycle analysis piece, and here this is the sort of similar sort of analogy to that. And the organization should also state how they plan to prepare and respond to emergency situations that might have adverse environmental impacts. Clause 8 is not as sub-clause heavy as clause 6 and clause 7. Here we have two sub-clauses which focus on operational control and emergency preparedness and response. In clause A, operational control, the organization should plan to ensure that it meets any EMS requirements. It has the processes in place to meet its environmental objectives and also implement any necessary actions to address those risks. Now, planning and control should be considered at each life cycle stage. Again, this takes us back to the life cycle graphic that was put up earlier. Slightly heavy section now in terms of emergency preparedness and response. We're just going to touch on it very lightly here, but in terms of your organization, it'll be very specific to your organization, depends on the activities you've got, the aspects and impacts. So the organization must establish, implement and maintain the relevant processes they need to be prepared for and respond in the event of any emergencies. Getting closer to the end of the clauses now. Here we're on performance evaluation, clause 9. Here the organization needs to outline how they'll monitor, measure, analyze and evaluate their EMS. And this should also include plans for an internal audit program and also management reviews. Now clause 9 has also sub-clauses. There are 3 sub-clauses with their own sub-sub-clauses. We're going to cover all of those in the next few slides. In clause 9, performance evaluation, we talk about monitoring, measurement, analysis and evaluation. The organization has to determine what needs to be monitored and measured, the criteria against which the performance is evaluated, and when it's going to be done. When are we going to do the monitoring and measuring? The details of the results should be analyzed and evaluated, and they should also verify the measurement processes and techniques that are being used. If it requires equipment, that needs to be calibrated, etc. And also, they need to evaluate the performance and do some benchmarking if needed. Clause 9, we can consider 2 types of monitoring measures. They could be active monitoring measures or reactive monitoring measures. What do we mean by that? Well, active monitoring measures is the monitoring of performance standards, for example, systematic inspection of plant and premises, monitoring of emissions, waste, water and energy data, and environmental inspections and any tools. There could also be audits and management reviews as well. When it comes to reactive monitoring measures, these are typically data on near misses. It could be complaints and suggestions, or it could even be enforcement actions that is placed on the organization. Two important ways of monitoring measures, active and reactive. But what about data sources and examples when it comes to reviewing environmental performance? Here, the organization needs to gather information to review the environmental performance. This could include things like incident data, inspections, control and monitoring of emissions, any energy and raw material data they have, how they're managing it, anything to do with waste, how we're managing the waste side in the business. Also, any surveys, tours and sampling records, any quality assurance reports and audits, any monitoring data, records, reports, complaints, and also let's not forget investigating environmental incidents. This is just a small selection of data sources and examples that the organization can have when it comes to reviewing environmental performance. It's not limited to this in your organization. You may have a different set. You may have all of these, you may have some of these, you may have a completely different set. So it's worthwhile reviewing those at the same time. When it comes to looking at evaluation of compliance, the organization should take timely action where necessary to address non-compliance issues, and they should retain documented information as evidence on the compliance evaluation results. They should also determine requirements for the evaluation of compliance, also the frequency for monitoring compliance. Some very, very key pieces here on evaluation of compliance for the organization. Some key things here in terms of audits and inspections, but what are they? Well, an audit assess overall compliance. It's a check. And inspections are considered them as compliance checklists. They're the do piece in our plan, do, check, act loop. Now, for EMS audits, an organization must define their criteria. They must conduct internal audits at planned intervals and provide information on whether the EMS conforms to the requirements of the clauses in the standard, also meets the organization's own requirements, and is being effectively implemented and maintained. In internal audits, they're used to check the reliability of the EMS data. An organization should establish an internal audit program including all the requirements of the standard and conduct internal audits at planned intervals to make sure that they're in compliance. Now, internal or environmental audits help the organization to maintain momentum towards achieving their environmental objectives. So they play a very key, vital, important role when it comes to environmental management within the organization. Management review, well, there are two types, formal and informal. These require reviews of the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the EMS to be undertaken by the top management at planned intervals. Now, an organization can set their own format for these reviews and the frequency and intervals for the review process. But ideally, the management review should include representation from all areas of the organization if it's going to get buy-in and support within the organization through its entirety. On performance evaluation, here we're looking at management review and input side. These are things such as what are the status of actions from previous management reviews? Are there any changes in external and internal issues that are relevant to the EMS? What is the progress on the objectives? And what details have been communicated regarding performance? Those are input side. On the output side, we can look at things like the conclusions on the suitability, the adequacy and the effectiveness of the EMS. Are there any decisions related to continual improvement opportunities? What are the decisions related to any need for changes to the EMS and any actions where it's needed for objectives that haven't been achieved? And here we are on the final clause, clause 10, of the standard, which is on improvement. Now, as with most ISO standards, a commitment to continual improvement is an important aspect. Here, you need to also address non-conformities in the EMS processes and any corrective actions. The EMS should be kept up with any changes in the business and also processes and any new regulations that come into place. Clause 10 has 3 subclauses, general piece, looking at non-conformances and corrective action, continual improvement. When it comes to non-conformity and corrective actions, here the organization needs to react to non-conformances and take actions to control and to correct it. They need to look at mitigating environmental impacts. They need to plan to eliminate the causes of non-conformity and implement any necessary actions that are required to review effectiveness. On continual improvement, the organization should continually improve the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the EMS. So in sub-element 2.2 there, we got really heavy into the various clauses. I would recommend that you take time to just assimilate and absorb these clauses. And if you have access to the ISO standard, you can read it in more detail. It's quite good reading, and it can help in terms of reinforcing some of the content that's been shared within these slides. Benefits and limitations of introducing a formal EMS into the workplace. We need some definitions, right, for what is accreditation and certification. Accreditation is the formal recognition by an independent body, generally known as an accreditation body, that a certification body operates according to international standards. Whereas certification is the provision of an independent body of written assurance, your certificate, that the product, service, or system in question meets the specific requirements. So benefits and limitations of a formal EMS, let's look at those. Firstly, it supports a legislative tracking and compliance requirement. For example, external audits can increase awareness of current legislation and also any upcoming regulations as well. It can help towards reducing costs and also increase the savings. For example, reduce non-compliance with environmental regulations and also then fines. It can also help towards managing environmental challenges and risks because focused efforts are there in identification, assessment, and significance rating for these risks, which allows prioritization so that the business can focus specifically and focus in terms of operational needs as well. Other benefits include that it provides a competitive advantage over other companies that are not certified. It also helps towards improving reputation and confidence from stakeholders. They feel that the business has pedigree. It provides increased credibility due to an unbiased approach, and many tenders nowadays also state that an EMS is required, so this puts you ahead on the curve. Other things also, it provides improved workforce morale and also external stakeholder engagement. Employees feel like they have an important role to play and support in the decision making. External stakeholders such as suppliers appreciate that the environmental objectives are being addressed. Previously, we talked about roles and responsibilities, and we talked about how in ISO 14001 we pull all that together. Here you can see how it then really just adds a little bit more context in terms of the benefits because people feel that they are engaged within the organization. It also helps us in terms of meeting global trends and changes in environmental challenges, demands, and issues. Pressure from regulators, we talked in element 1 all about Extinction Rebellion and other external forces. This will help us in terms of really giving some assurance to them that we are following due diligence and having a good environmental management focus. It's also a universally recognized standard. It's based on an international framework, and hence it can be applied to any organization. The visibility on expectations are clear, and also it's in the public domain so that people can actually see what the organization is up to. We talked earlier about benefits. Here we're talking about limitations, and one of that limitations are it is prescriptive in that performance levels aren't clearly defined within the standard. And the other thing is that the environmental performance is subjective. Improvements in the performance can be negligible and is not clearly defined for SMEs, small medium enterprises. The reporting and follow-up requirements can vary depending on organization. Public reporting aspects and requirements from certification bodies can vary significantly. There's also subjectivity on audits and assessments. The knowledge and competency of internal and external reviewers can vary significantly. And there's also potential bias which can skew the results and findings in the system. There are also cost and resource issues and impact. There can be quite high implementation costs, and it could be quite restrictive for small, medium enterprises. And resources can be taken away from normal day-to-day operations, especially if there's an increase in headcount isn't factored in, and therefore you still have to meet all these environmental management requirements. In roles and responsibilities, we did mention that there are specific roles and responsibilities, and these are sometimes seen as add-on or bolt-on if people are already working to the hilt in terms of what they have to do as tasks. This could also be one of the limitations in achievement. So in conclusions, there are lots of benefits and drawbacks when it comes to a formal EMS in the workplace. It's important to take into consideration all of these before a go, no-go decision is made, whether you go for a formal certified environmental management system through an accreditation body.